On August 15th, 1981, at 6 p.m. in the evening, Mother Angelica put EWTN on the air for the very first time, and the first program aired. What was that program, and what was it about? Stay tuned and find out as we will discuss this topic further. Hello and welcome. I'm Father Joseph Mary, chaplain here at EWTN, filling in on EWTN Live for Father Mitch Pacwa, who is away. And I'm happy to do so tonight because of the topic, which has always been of great interest to me and to so many. It is the Shroud of Turin, the reputed burial cloth of Jesus Christ. You know, Mother Angelica decided to begin EWTN's programming on that first evening EWTN went on the air by broadcasting a documentary on the Shroud of Turin. Back in the late 1970s, I was an engineering student in Chicago, and I was reading a magazine about new technologies, which had an article about a group of American scientists who had been permitted by the Vatican to examine the Shroud of Turin using the latest technology. I was fascinated with the article and really have been ever since. Tonight we are happy to welcome to EWTN one of the men among that original group of scientists and researchers, Mr. Barrie Schwortz. Welcome, Barrie.
Thank you, Father.
Now, Barrie, where did the idea come from to form a team that would go and research the Shroud of Turin image?
Well, several scientists at Los Alamos National Laboratories and their sister laboratory, Sandia Labs, had a device called a VP8 image analyzer, and it basically allowed you to put a photograph into it using just a black and white video camera. And that then allowed you to extract the information and raise and lower it. And normally when you put a photograph or an artwork into the VP8, you get a rather distorted, jumbled kind of result. Mm-hmm. When they put a photograph of the Shroud of Turin into the VP8, they got the natural relief of a human form, which shouldn't be possible.
Right.
And it indicated immediately to them that there was something unique about the image on the shroud, something that was not typical of any other images that any of us were familiar with, and there were a bunch of imaging scientists involved in the group. So that became effectively the catalyst that led these scientists to say, look, let's put together a team of experts in various appropriate disciplines, and let's see if we can get permission and go to Turin and examine the shroud to determine and answer a single question: how was the image formed? Ironically, after 5 days and nights of examination, 2 years of planning before we went, and 3 years of reducing the data and publishing it afterwards, the result was that we could not answer that question. We could tell you what it's not. It's not a photograph, it's not a painting, it's not a rubbing, and it's not a scorch. But we know of no mechanism today that can create an image with those same chemical and physical properties.
So this was technology that was being used by like the Voyager exploration. Well, so they were taking images out in space and they were translating those into 3D images, and they discovered that this had a 3D property too. The shroud image.
Exactly. There's depth information, or like topographical information, is encoded into the image. And we had members on the team not just from Los Alamos and Sandia Labs, but the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, the Air Force Academy, and of course NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. And interestingly enough, my hero on the team, Don Lynn, was the imaging project manager in charge of all imaging on Voyager and Viking and Mariner and Galileo projects, among others. So I was thrilled to be on the team with someone of that. You know, I'm a photographer, a professional photographer, and a NASA imaging scientist is about as good as it gets.
Some very prestigious people
Very much
in their
so.
own fields were going to examine this shroud.
Yeah, and I was very honored to have been asked to be a participant.
And how did that happen? How did that come about that you were invited?
I had done a project as a consultant to Los Alamos National Laboratories, worked with another man named Don Devan, and we finished the project. It was 7 months long, and obviously it had something to do with atomic bombs. We finished that project, and I went back to my normal routine. And a few weeks later, Don Devan called me again, and he said, "Gee, Barrie, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I kind of laughed, and I said, "But Don, I'm Jewish." And Don laughed, and he said, "So am I, remember?" And I went, "Oh, yeah." So Don asked me to be on the team, and immediately I said no, because I felt uncomfortable with the thought of being involved with something I perceived to be a Christian object or relic, and I just wasn't very comfortable. I was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home, very much like Fiddler on the Roof.
Right.
Both my parents born in Poland, the grandparents lived with us. It was really like that. So I was very uncomfortable, but the image properties caught my attention. And if I can just add at that moment, the man I mentioned from NASA, Don Lynn, I remember saying to Don one day after he had joined the team, "Gee, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing involved with the Shroud?" And he looked at me, and he was Catholic, and he said, "Barrie, perhaps you've forgotten that the man in question's a Jew." And I said, "No, Don, that's about the only thing I know about Jesus." But I knew he was Jewish. And he said, "Oh, so you don't believe that God would want one of his chosen people on our team?" And then I laughed. And I said, no, I didn't think that. Don gave me the best advice perhaps I've been giving him all of my life. He said, "Barrie, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." Those words were the words that kept me on the team.
Yeah.
And of course, I've never regretted it. And I'm grateful that I was able to, before Don passed, to thank him for saying those words to me. And truthfully, in retrospect, I really believe that was God speaking to me through his voice.
Yeah. And you really did not expect that it was something authentic, that you would very quickly discover that it had been painted, that it was a forgery.
I unfortunately said publicly, "Give us 5 minutes, we'll find the paint and the brushstrokes, and we'll go home." It's 35 years later, I'm still here.
You're still here.
And of course, I would say within the first 10 or 15 minutes of the shroud being placed before us, you know, we photographers always carry high-power magnifying glasses in our pockets. I immediately started looking for paint and brushstrokes, and guess what? There is absolutely none on that cloth, other than a few microscopic particles of paint that came from copies of the shroud that were painted by artists through the centuries and then permitted to be laid onto the cloth to sanctify
Oh,
them.
I see.
And so a few paint particles would come off, but in the images, in the area of the image, there's absolutely no more of those microscopic particles than there is in the non-image area. That is not what forms the image on the shroud.
What was some of the equipment that you brought with you to examine the shroud? I know you said you were very careful not to damage the shroud in any way.
Every test that we designed, and we spent 17 months before we left planning and designing our exam, every test was designed first to be non-destructive. We didn't want to cause any harm to the cloth. So rather than, so to find a way to fasten it so that we could raise it up and look at it, they designed and fabricated a steel table so we could fasten the shroud to the table with magnets, thus causing no harm. Ironically, it had been on public display, and when they took it off public display and brought it to us, it had been thumbtacked onto a piece of wood. And here they are taking out the thumbtacks, and I'm looking at it and thinking all the trouble we went through to preserve it, and they had already crucified the shroud.
Oh, boy. So when you arrived there, was the church involved in the research? Were they overseeing it and telling you what to do, or
Father,
dictating that sort of thing?
At the beginning, you have to remember, first of all, the owner of the shroud until 1985 was King Umberto, the last Duke of Savoy of the royal monarchy of Italy. He was in exile in Portugal, but his family, the Savoy family, owned the shroud for about 600 years. So our primary permission came from King Umberto. He and his family had always had the church be the custodians, the caretakers of it. And so we needed, of course, their permission as well. So we developed and created a 70-page test plan detailing every aspect of every experiment, which they saw and ultimately approved.
But as far as carrying out the research, was the church involved in telling you
Right.
you can do this or you can't do that?
Actually, I was shocked at how they distanced themselves away from us. The king had an emissary there. There were two priests there. Monsignor Catino, who was the keeper of the shroud, had several of the keys of the three keys to the reliquary. Monsignor Carmelo, who was the pastor of the cathedral, and they sat and observed. They absolutely had no bearing on anything we did, and they intentionally stayed back so that it would not appear that they were trying to influence the science, and I promise you they had absolutely no impact on what we did other than to observe.
They were just observing, so it was really faith and science working together to come to the truth.
And of course, you and I discussed this earlier, but you know, my definition, I always hear this, that there's this war between science and faith. And I thought about it long and hard, and I came to realize that science is simply man's attempt to understand God's creation. So why should they be opposed to each other?
That they're both leading us toward the truth, right? So we're not afraid of science.
That's right.
We want to know the truth scientifically, and also the faith is leading us to God.
I agree,
well.
and
Right.
I think that for me, the most important part of all this that has led me to do what we're going to talk about here in lecturing around the world and educating people to the shroud was that I was very frustrated. When we came back and I saw the media reports, I realized that my Christian brothers and sisters were not getting the truth about the Shroud of Turin. That was very frustrating and irritating to me because I was there, I was a witness to the event, I was a participant, and it was very frustrating to see how things were spun in the press that turned the kind of the interest in the shroud away from the cloth and sort of speculating that, oh, we were a bunch of religious fanatics and the science was not valid and all this. And frankly, I don't think that any group of scientists in the world could have done something better than what we did in 1978. But of course, by today's standards, we're very limited by the technology of the time. What we had was the best that was available to us in 1978.
What would you say were some of the findings that surprised you?
Well, I'm not certain that I was too surprised by much, but there were a few things about the shroud that were hard for me to grasp. And the first one was something we noted almost immediately. I was with Vernon Miller, who was our chief scientific photographer, a dear friend of mine, passed away. And Vernon and I looked at the shroud. We stood next to each other, and we saw that the blood was still reddish or crimson in color. Vern had a lot of experience in forensic work, and he and I both knew that old blood is supposed to turn brown or red, or black rather, not red, and not stay red. And that was kind of a deal breaker. Both Vern and I just kind of looked at it and went, nah, that's when I thought maybe that's paint. But it turns out that the blood chemist on our team, Dr. Alan Adler, another Jewish member of our team and a world-renowned blood chemist, did the analysis and proved, and you'll find me using that word only occasionally, but we proved that the blood is not paint or pigment, but actual human blood. It had hemoglobin and porphyrins and other components of blood. And also, Dr. Adler found a very high content of bilirubin. And that's commonly the case when someone is tortured over a period of time, not given water, body goes into shock, the liver starts producing bilirubin and pumping it into the bloodstream. And Adler had found a very high content of bilirubin in the blood. So it's blood.
And if that's present in the blood, then the blood remains red.
Yes, bilirubin is it's a hemolytic agent. It breaks down the red blood cell walls. And once that happens, the blood stays red forever. But I didn't find that out until 17 years later.
Now, you obviously believe in the authenticity of the shroud. What are some of the things that you concluded in examining the shroud that have led you to believe, as well as what you just mentioned, but other things that led?
Well, as soon as I had the opportunity to look at it closely, I realized my stupid statement about seeing the blood, seeing the brush marks and going home was that was over with. There are no brush strokes. There is no paint or pigment, and it didn't take me very long to put that idea aside. But that didn't explain some of these unique properties, the encoding of depth or spatial information or topographical information. That's, if you really look at it from a scientific point of view, the only way that can happen is if there's some interaction between the cloth and the body it covers. So that really forces you to accept that there had to be a body with the cloth covering it. And so that was one of the important things. But I'll tell you, people often ask me, what was it that brought me over the edge? Well, 17 years later, it was finding out that the bilirubin caused the blood to remain red, but I didn't know that for a long time. I was pretty much convinced that the shroud was most likely authentic, but I wasn't completely convinced. And of course, until I found out about the bilirubin. But there were so many things that when people ask me what was it that convinced me, I only can answer all of the above. What people don't understand is there's such a vast amount of information about this cloth now that's been gathered, and it's almost overwhelming. And ironically, you think you're going to go and you're going to examine this cloth and you're going to answer the questions.
Right.
And instead we came back with 1,000 new questions and very few answers. But we did eliminate painting and scorching and these or photographic means. So all of those were eliminated, but that didn't really bring us any closer to an answer. As I said earlier, the evidence basically shows us that we don't know a mechanism that can make an image with these chemical and physical properties.
And we know where this shroud was from like the 1350s or so. We can definitively say where it was.
Correct. The chain of custody, the chain of its history, starts in the mid-1300s with an unbroken chain of custody until today. The problem, and of course this is what gives the skeptics all the ammunition, is there are breaks in the history of the shroud. And what people often forget is this is a Jewish burial cloth with blood on it. Jewish law says it must remain in the tomb. So how did this burial cloth of a Jewish man, how did it escape the tomb? Why was it not buried with the body? And that's a good question, because Jewish law says it can't leave the tomb. So I have to share with you what my 90-year-old mother said. Jewish mother, born in Poland, not well educated, high school, emigrated to America as a child. She heard one of my lectures about 8 years ago, and afterward she was very quiet. And when a Jewish mother's quiet, be afraid. I was very nervous. And so I turned to her mother, and I said, "Mother, what do you think?" And she turned to me in that typical kind of condescending Jewish mother attitude, and she said, "Barrie, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it didn't belong to Jesus. If it belonged to anyone else, nobody would care."
Right.
And I laughed, and I thought, what a clever response. The more I realized and thought about it, I realized this was a very profound observation. This is a burial shroud.
Yeah.
And why did they keep it? Why was it kept? Now, people often ask me why the Gospels don't mention it. Well, Jewish law says it has to be in the tomb, and it also bears an image, which is also forbidden by Jewish law. So the disciples could not come running out of the tomb saying, "Look what we found." It would have been destroyed, and they might have been the next ones to be punished. So I think that it makes sense that it was hidden away and kept secret for a very long time. So these breaks in its history provides all the ammunition in the world for the skeptics to deny it, but there are many signs of it, of cloths bearing the image of Jesus, mentioned throughout history, starting in about the 4th or 5th century, again in the 9th century, in the and 10th century. So throughout history, there are references to a cloth like the shroud, but of course it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin until it arrived in Turin in 1578.
And everything is anatomically correct, right? Even before they knew some of the medical properties of blood, whether it's coming from veins or from arteries.
That's correct.
That it's anatomically correct on the shroud.
Beyond anatomically correct, since we are living in a kind of a CSI environment now, everybody knows all the buzzwords. It is absolutely forensically accurate, and the real experts who have studied it that are forensic scientists say that it is absolutely perfect, that it is like studying a real crime scene. And Dr. Zugaby, whose book you're familiar with, may rest in peace, just passed away recently.
Yes.
He studied it. He was the medical examiner of Rockland County, New York. He studied it and studied crucifixion for over 50 years and the effects of crucifixion on the body. And he said the only way this cloth got the blood stains and things that it shows was by coming in contact with the body. There's no other way. No artist could have done that. And interestingly enough, the blood stains apparently were on the cloth before the image formed. So if a forger was going to make this, he would first put forensically accurate blood stains onto a blank sheet and then paint a body around it without paint.
Right.
Well, I don't think that's very possible.
That we can say it's very impossible for anyone to have produced this, right, from the human hand.
Think
How could
about
you do it?
this. Father, we now live in probably the most image-oriented age in our history.
Yes.
Everyone has a camera in their hand, a computer on their lap. We do imaging. 2-year-old kids are playing with images on computers now. And yet, with all that technology and capability, no one has been able to even come close to duplicating the chemical and physical properties on the shroud.
Well, let's talk about the carbon-14 dating that was done in 1988, which many people said discounted it as a fraud.
Well, in 1988, a tiny sample was taken from the cloth, was divided in half, and one half put away and the other half divided in thirds and given to 3 different radiocarbon dating labs. They applied their radiocarbon dating techniques to it. They came up with 3 different dates within a range of a few hundred years of each other, and based on that one test, declared the shroud was a fake. Now, in the real world of science, if you do 100 tests and 99 tests point in one direction and one test points in the opposite direction, ask any real scientist in the world and they'll tell you they throw that one away.
Right.
Sadly, in the case of the shroud, all of the evidence that our team had gathered and had accumulated from historians up until that moment in history was discarded in favor of one test that was not properly performed in the first place on a very poorly chosen sample, but the world chose to accept that it was a fake based on that one test when everything else pointed in the opposite direction.
And that carbon-14 dating is not infallible. It's not the gold standard, although it's...
It is accepted as a valid scientific test for dating. However, there are certain objects, organic objects, that cannot be dated. Certain mollusks, if you dated certain mollusks, you would get a date 20,000 years in the future.
Wow.
So obviously there are some things about carbon dating that are problematic and critically important. And I don't want to be critical of the carbon dating process, which I think is a valid process, because in 2005, new data came out and new evidence came out that was published in a very highly regarded peer-reviewed journal that proved, and again, that's only the second time I've used that word tonight, proved that the sample taken for carbon dating on the shroud was anomalous, different than the rest of the cloth, and did not represent that cloth. So it was not a valid sample for age dating the cloth. They dated a repaired corner. And when I say repaired, it's not a patch that would be obvious. It was rewoven and dyed to match the rest of the cloth. So it took experts looking at macro photographs of that area to detect the fact that this had been manipulated. But 3 independent experts testified to the fact that this was absolutely manipulated, had been repaired. They dated the repair.
I saw the TED Talk that you gave in Rome on the shroud, and you quoted the words of Sherlock Holmes. Maybe you could...
Sure. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was one of my heroes when I was young. I read everything he wrote. And once I got the word about the bilirubin from Dr. Adler and understood why the blood was red, it was the last thing left. So I applied the rule that Conan Doyle spoke through the lips of Sherlock Holmes, who said, if you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. And with that axiom applied, I realized I accepted the shroud had to be authentic at that moment in time.
That if you look at the totality of the data, not just one test, but the totality of the data, that's the conclusion that leads you to.
And see, that's the point, that's what happened to me. I had a long period of time, almost 20 years, to contemplate. And remember, I had access to everything. I was a participant. I had held it in my hand. And so I think that it was the accumulation of data and not any one item, but all of the above that was the answer to what ultimately convinced me. And trust me, Father, I was looking for any excuse to deny it. I have to be honest. I'm talking to a priest. Of course I have to be on.
Well, for our viewers, you know, at the Shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament, Mother Angelica has an exhibit of the Shroud of Turin. And this is one more reason for you to come here and to visit EWTN and the Shrine to see this life-size representation of the Shroud of Turin. And I learned, I didn't know this before the show, that Barrie was involved in that as well.
Those are my photographs. Those are our life-size backlit transparency photographs that I guess it was about 10 or 15 years ago. I was approached by a mutual friend, a gentleman who runs a Shroud Center in Richmond, Virginia. He had already obtained them for his Shroud Center, and he said that he wanted to donate a set of them to Mother Angelica because she was building a shrine in Hanceville. And so downstairs, I've never seen it other than in a few photographs. 4 of my life-size photographs of the Shroud are on display, and I'm thrilled to hear they're still on display there.
So they have photographs of the actual shroud and then
Correct.
also the photographic negatives side by side.
Correct. We have the natural color image so that people can see the way it looks to the eye, and then we have the very famous light-dark reversed photograph of the shroud as it would appear on a photographic negative. Because interestingly enough, the image that's on the cloth itself is light-dark reverse from what we're used to seeing, meaning it's the negative. When you photograph it onto film, that becomes a positive, and that is a much more natural image. So the shroud is the negative, and the negative we make of it becomes the positive. A little confusing, I know, but people are very familiar with it, and I think they're showing a photograph right now, the face compared to natural color face to the negative view.
So we'd invite any pilgrims that want to come and see that, as well as attend one of the shows like our pilgrims here from North Carolina. I also have here on the table, this is a portrait that was done by our Polish Poor Clares of Perpetual Adoration. You know, Mother Angelica belongs to an order that was founded in 1854, and they have monasteries. There's monasteries in India, in Poland, in Austria. And the Polish sisters sent this image, which is based on the Shroud of Turin, that you can see the face of Jesus. And so you get a little bit of a glimpse into what Jesus looked like from the shroud and a portrait based on that.
You know, ironically, this is a man who died 2,000 years ago, yet almost everybody in the world will identify that and say, oh, that's Jesus. And I think that that is very telling. I mean, we don't know how too many people 2,000 years ago looked, yet everyone, Christians, Jews, even Muslims, can look at that and go, oh, that's Jesus. Why? Because all the iconography that started pretty much back in about the 4th century all the way through into modern times, much of that iconography was based on the image of the shroud. And we found similarities. There's a crease under the chin of the man of the shroud. It's just a crease in the cloth, but it shows up as a line. And in some of the icons, that line is there, so it's obvious they had seen the shroud.
Now tell us about your website. It's the most visited website for shroud information.
It's the oldest and the largest website. In '95, I got a phone call from a friend who said, you know, that shroud thing you're involved with, turns out it's just a photo by Leonardo da Vinci. And I thought he was joking. I thought it was a joke. And I said, yeah, where'd you get that? Because Da Vinci, well, the shroud was being shown 100 years before Da Vinci was born. Now, he was a good artist, but he wasn't that good. So I asked him, where did you get that information? And he said, well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store. And there it was on one of the tabloids. And it was at that moment I had an epiphany and realized I was privileged. I was on the inside track. I had access to the information. I was a participant. I touched the cloth myself and studied it up close. But the public didn't read scientific journals, and they had no access. While I was on the phone, I wrote 4 words on the manila folder on my desk: consider building a website. In January of 1996, Shroud.com went online. It is now the oldest, largest, and most visited and most extensive website on the subject. And I often hear from people, oh, you know, you're #1 on Google. And so I have to remind them we're 5 years older than Google.
So you have great resources like scientific studies that were done on the shroud. You have large images, number of images that are available there. And
lots of photographs. many papers. It got so big I had to put a search engine on so I could find what I'd put somewhere. It got so large. It has virtually everything. There's a list of speakers. There's a list of Shroud centers around the world. I can't even think of it all. It's huge. There's a huge book list, the definitive book list of something like 1,400 books that have been written on the subject are listed. So it's really an extensive resource and continues to be a primary resource for those who wish to study the Shroud. The idea being to preserve all this data so that future researchers don't have to start from the beginning again.
Right.
And so I'm very proud to have been able to do that. And of course, I never expected it was going to grow the way the internet did. When I started in '96, a few kind of geeks and computer nerds. Well, those were the ones on the internet. Then, of course, a few years later, it exploded.
That's wonderful. Well, we're enjoying our conversation here with Barrie Schwortz, who was on the original investigating team for the Shroud of Turin. And we're going to be taking a break now, and then we'll take your questions and also those of the studio audience. So please stay with us. Hello again, I'm Father Joseph Mary, filling in for Father Mitch for EWTN Live, and we're having a wonderful conversation with Mr. Barrie Schwortz, who was involved in looking into the Shroud of Turin, a scientific investigation back in 1978. We have a caller, Sharon in New York. Hello, Sharon, what is your question?
Hi, Father.
Hello, welcome.
Hi.
And what's your question?
Hi, Mr. Schwartz.
Hi.
Thank you for taking my call. As we all know, we see so many depictions of Jesus when he was nailed. In the shroud, were the nails through his hand or were they through his wrist? And my second part of my question is, how tall was he?
Good
questions. Well, first of all, the Greek word for hand does not exclude the middle of the palm or specify the middle of the palm or about 1 inch below. So if you take your thumb and your little finger, put them together, it forms a groove called the thenar furrow. If you're a Roman soldier and you've got to crucify 100 guys today, you grab the hand, you do that, you got a groove, you put the nail in, it goes in practically just below the center of the palm in the fleshy part, comes out exactly where it's shown on the shroud. What we see on the shroud is the exit wound. So we don't see the entry wound, so there's a lot of speculation. But if you're nailed through the middle and you're reasonably strong, you could rip your hand loose. If you're nailed just an inch below that in the thenar furrow between those fleshy parts, you're not going to be able to pull your hand out because of the bones that are there. But no bones were broken. That's important. Now, the height of the man is a good question because remember that the shroud is a substrate that can change its size and shape based on the relative humidity that it's in. And so it's difficult to measure and do measurements depending on the humidity and temperature in which the shroud is stored. But the other thing is this: unlike artworks that have a defined edge, the shroud image fades out as the distance between the cloth and the body increased. So where do you start your measurement? Where do you end your measurement? So we cannot do precision measurements, but generally accepted is 5'10", 5'11".
Okay, very good. We have a question here in the studio. Hello, what's your name and where are you from?
Celine, I live in the area in Birmingham. I heard on a documentary that because of the negative nature of the shroud that the hair would have been white. Is that true?
I've heard that. As a matter of fact, I know the doctor who suggested that. The problem is this. The Shroud of Turin does not contain any color information. So from the data that's on the shroud, you know, you can look at it and on a negative, dark hair will look white, white hair will look dark, but that doesn't indicate the actual color of the hair. We don't know the color of his hair, we don't know the color of his skin, the color of his eyes. Of course, they're closed, but those are the kind of things that kind of information cannot be gathered from the shroud. One can speculate, but we can't say that with any kind of scientific veracity.
Great. We have another question here in the studio. Hello, what's your name and where are you from?
I'm Anthony, and I'm from South Dakota.
And what is your question?
My question is, since there's evidence of blood on the shroud, can the blood be tested for DNA?
Actually, the blood was tested in 1995 in Texas, the University of Texas Health Science Center, by Dr. Victor Tryon. He was a DNA expert. He determined that the blood is male and human with normal chromosomes. But he also said that the segments are so degraded and so old that it's impossible to get a full DNA profile. And I always remind people that DNA analysis is a comparative analysis. So even if we had a full profile of the man of the shroud, who would you compare it to? Does anyone happen to have the provenance DNA of Jesus in their, in their laboratory somewhere? Of course not. So it's questionable because of the degradation and the age of it that any real value, any detailed information could come out of it. And again, then, like I said, who would we compare it with? So although DNA is important, the good news is this, because there have been so many stories and movies and TV shows about cloning Jesus or cloning the Antichrist from the blood of the shroud. Can't be done. You need a full DNA profile. So DNA is not going to be a very important test to apply to the shroud any further because it's too degraded. However, that technology continues to advance, and perhaps at some point in the future that might become viable.
Well, we have another lady here with a question. What's your name and where are you from?
My name is Mary Judas, and I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina.
Welcome.
My question is, how do you know he's a Jewish man?
Well, that's a great question, actually. Well, it just so happens that Jewish burial custom was very specific in the first century, and this is a perfect match of Jewish burial custom. So if you look at it that way, and also you can look in the New Testament in the Gospels, which tells us that they found the cloth, they found the linen strips that had bound him into the shroud, and they found the second cloth kept separate from the other because it also contained blood stains and fluids from his nose and mouth. Those had to stay in the tomb, and that was only typical of Jewish burial custom. So that would be a pretty strong indication this is a Jewish burial man, a Jewish burial shroud.
Now, your own father, you talked about?
I did. My father died in 2003. He had an Orthodox Jewish burial, plain wooden coffin. His body was not embalmed. He was wrapped in a shroud, but the only difference was, instead of wrapping it with linen strips to bind the body in, the side was sewn on either side. And consequently, it was like a mummy bag that you would slip the body into. But otherwise, it was pure linen, very much the same as the shroud, except that it was sewn on the sides.
We have a caller, Ray Downing, who has been involved in
the
work with the
Ray.
shrouds. So, hello, Ray. Welcome to the program.
Hi, how are you?
Did you have a question or a comment for our show tonight?
Well, the only thing that I have to say regarding it is I worked with Barrie on a television special for the History Channel, and Barrie is the best spokesman, I think, for the shroud and believes in its authenticity in spite of the fact that he's not Christian, he's Jewish. and so it's an interesting mix to have a Jewish advocate for the authenticity of the shroud, which is more than I personally could do. My notion of, from what I know of the shroud, is the jury's out on it. There's not enough information to declare it a fake, not enough information to say it's authentic. And so what I did is there's three-dimensional information contained in the shroud. That I'm convinced of. And I use the three-dimensional information as a blueprint, as a map for making a portrait, a new portrait of Jesus in 3D. And that was featured on 2 History Channel specials, The Real Face of Jesus and Jesus, The Lost 40 Days.
So a lot of our viewers have probably seen those programs.
Right. Thank you, Ray, and say hi to Maria for me.
I sure will. I sure will, Barry.
All right.
So, Barry, you've been involved in a lot of different programs on the Shroud, and news programs.
Pretty much all the networks.
All the networks have had you on.
As a matter of fact, this is my first time on EWTN, and one of my friends said, "Why did it take so long?" I said, "Well, I only go where I'm asked." And finally I was asked, so here I am.
We're glad you're here. We have another question here in the studio. Hello, what's your name and where are you from?
Hi, my name's Mike Stark and I'm from Lake Forest, Illinois. And my question is regarding the blood on the shroud. We've all seen The Passion, or I assume most of us have, and was quite gruesome. And I was just wondering how much blood actually appeared. I see the mark, as you said, the exit wound on the wrist, but I'm wondering how much more blood there was detected when you guys did your examination of it.
It's a great question. First thing I want to mention is that if you look at art depictions of the crucifixion from the earliest to the most recent, you'll see that Jesus always is covered with a modesty cloth, but not on the shroud, because artists have artistic license. So did Mel Gibson when he made his movie. And when you're making a movie and you're trying to get somebody to feel the horror of what was done, you get up close and you show graphic rending of flesh. Mel chose to use something called scorpione, which the Romans did have, but they used that. That was capital punishment if they used that on you. But Mel chose to use that, knowing that it wasn't historically accurate, but it served his purpose, again, artistic license, to indicate and get the audience sitting in front of that screen to feel the horror of the moment. As far as the blood goes, you know, there are theories, there's a debate going in the world of the shroud amongst forensic experts whether or not the body was washed. Now, we know in the Gospels it says there wasn't time for a full anointing of the body. It was the approaching Sabbath starting at sundown, so they had to stop, and they were coming back Sunday to finish. Personally, having a Jewish mother of my own, I can't believe that Mary would allow them to put him in that tomb without at least a quick washing of the body. And that's why we see the blood stains the way we do. They re-wet the blood stains, and what we're seeing here is blood exudate, not the flowing of blood, because he was dead when he was wrapped in the cloth. The other thing, and I want to make quickly clear, is that some people say dead bodies don't bleed, but Dr. Zugabe, in his book, showed a time-lapse series of photographs of a body had come in 4 hours dead, stabbed, and he wiped them with just a wet cloth, put up the camera, and kept taking photos, and there's a successive series of photos showing blood continuing to ooze out of the body at least 4 to 6 hours after death.
There's no sign of decomposition in the body.
Absolutely not. Yeah. People often forget that they say that Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days. That's 3 Jewish calendar days. Started on Friday, but late in the day. The Sabbath began at sundown. He was there all day Saturday, and Sunday morning the tomb was empty. It's about 36 hours. Okay, and in that period of time, under those conditions in a tomb, there is no evidence of any liquefaction or liquefaction decay, because there probably wasn't adequate time for it. So we don't see that on the shroud, and that's actually very consistent with the Gospels that said that he was not corrupt or corrupted, meaning no decay.
Well, we have another studio question. Hello, what is your name and where are you from?
Father, I'm Tim from North Carolina.
Welcome.
And my question for Doctor is, have you done any investigation on the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe?
Well, first let me thank you for calling me doctor. My Jewish mother will be thrilled, but I'm not a doctor. Recently I was at a conference, a special invitation conference in Jerusalem. And attending the conference, aside from a number of us who had studied the shroud, including Dr. John Jackson and his wife Rebecca, John was the founder of our team, they wanted us there to meet with the folks from Mexico who had studied the tilma, to kind of compare notes, and we had a couple of days of roundtable discussion, and they asked us to make some recommendations. Now, I understand the story of the tilma, and I recognize how significant and important it is to the evangelization of the country of Mexico. It was, and as a matter of fact, Juan Diego was sainted.
Yes.
So my suggestion was this: let's study and determine the best way to preserve the tilma. Let's learn what material it's on. They're not even sure. They think it could be hemp because it's outlasted the agape material that they thought it was initially. But I think that, you know, giving it too much scrutiny might disappoint some people. And having seen what we've seen and studied what we've studied, I would say this, that, you know, some things perhaps are best left alone. And my advice to them was, and that was why I was there, was to put my 2 cents in. My advice was, let's study how to preserve it and leave it at that.
We have a caller, Jesus. Welcome, Jesus. And
Good evening, Father.
where are you from and what is your question?
I'm calling from New York, and what I'd like to know is, Mr. Schwortz, how has the findings of the Shroud and your experience with it has changed your life?
Wow. Okay. Well, that's an interesting question. In 1996, I built the website. Once I built the website and began to take a more public role in speaking out about my belief the Shroud was authentic, the questions changed. And people started asking me what I called the ultimate question: what do you believe? Well, I'd walked away from Judaism when I was 13. It never made me feel connected to God, but of course I was raised in that, I was born in that, so I'm Jewish, and raised in that tradition. But at that age, I was 50 years old when that happened, I realized that to give an honest answer, which I'm compelled to do if I'm going to do this work, I was going to have to look in my own heart for the first time as an adult and consider what I believed. I didn't even know how to answer the question. Well, because I was raised in the Fiddler on the Roof Orthodox tradition of Judaism, God was part of everything every day. And amazingly, when I opened my heart and looked in and was honest with myself about that for the first time, I found that I always had a deep faith in God. God was in there just waiting for me to acknowledge Him. So how many Jews can say the Shroud of Turin led them back to their faith in God? I can.
That's wonderful. We have another studio question.
Thank you,
Hello,
Father.
what's your name and where are you from?
My name is Joe Montone. I'm from Yardley, Pennsylvania. And Mr. Schwartz, my question is right in line with the last caller. What effect has your own investigation and conclusion to the Shroud of Turin had upon your own faith and the faith of your family?
Well, as I just said, my faith basically, I didn't think that I even had faith until I really looked openly and honestly inside my own heart. I don't know that it's had much of an effect on my family. Typically people want to know what Jewish people think of the Shroud, and you know, they're not very threatened by it. Many Jewish people, and many of my Jewish friends have said to me, well, you've studied it for 35 years, you held it in your hand, you've been part of the research, you've accessed all the science. And I've always said, yeah, you know, I've had this privilege. So they say, well, what do you think? And I always say, well, I accept that it's authentic, that's good enough for us. So my Jewish friends don't have a problem with it. I've discovered in my travels that the biggest skeptics almost inevitably are Christians. And that just baffles me. But that's perhaps why I'm here to talk about this, is to give them perhaps a bit more confidence that why would I do this? What do I gain? I'm not paid very well. It's not about money, Father. I do make a little more than you do, but not much. And so my point simply is the only reason I'm doing this, look, I was greatly privileged to be in that room. There are probably 1 billion people on this planet who had more right to be there than I did. But then, for some reason, God dragged me kicking and screaming, put me on the team and kept me there. And so, as I often say at the end of my lectures, isn't it funny how God always picks a Jew to be the messenger? I'm a messenger.
So you really believe that God is calling you to continue to talk about this?
You know,
it's
Father,
not that you're trying to necessarily persuade anybody, but you just want to present the facts.
Yeah, look, I'm not that clever to have thought to do this. I didn't want to do this. I tried to quit a couple times. So I actually believe that this is exactly why I was on the team. It wasn't about making photographs. Sure, that was the entree. But ultimately, it served, I was there to collect everything, put it all together, and ultimately preserve it, archive it, and make it available to the public free at no charge. And I'm not sure if I got the last part of that question that you asked about. I'm sorry. Give me the last part of your question one more time.
Yeah, that's not something that you are trying to persuade anyone necessarily.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I was approached by a gentleman in Canada after one of my lectures, and he said, "Mr. Schwortz," he said, "that was a great lecture, but you'll never convince me." And I looked him right in the eye and I said, "Sir, what makes you think I even care what you believe? That's between you and God. Take it up with him." He smiled, and I answered his question.
So you're just presenting the facts as they were collected and giving a resource where people can access
It would
that.
be totally inappropriate for me to get involved in discussions or in presenting people with my opinion of how they should believe. I didn't even believe myself for so many years. I'm not the one qualified to do that. My job, like I said, is to bring the information, to bring it in an honest, non-kind of dramatic way, to tell them the truth, to let them know that the science backs up everything we found. And at that point in time, I always say, look, the shroud didn't come with a book of instructions, and the answer isn't going to be the answer to faith can't be on a piece of cloth, but perhaps in the eyes and the hearts of those who look upon it.
Yes. I think we have time for one more call. We have Joanne. Hello, Joanne. Where are you from, and what is your question?
I'm in Louisiana, Father.
Okay.
I was wondering if Mr. Schwortz would comment on the medallion in Oviedo, Spain, and its correlation to the shroud.
Okay, the cloth that's in Spain is the sudarium. That's the sudarium of Oviedo. It's been in Spain since, I believe, the 5th or 6th century. It is the second cloth mentioned in the Gospels, in my opinion. It is a head cloth, a cloth that would have been wrapped around the face when Jesus was removed from the tomb, and there's an image of it on screen now. And I was given the privilege of seeing that when I was in Spain 2 years ago. They actually opened the reliquary and showed it to me. And that is a cloth that you'll find a lot about it on shroud.com, because I believe this is the one cloth that is related to the shroud. Some of the blood stains on the sudarium line up and match with some of the blood stains on the shroud. And if you look at where the fluids have stained the sudarium and lay an image of the shroud over it, you'll see they match exactly where the nose and the mouth are. So I believe that's the second cloth mentioned in the Gospels, which somebody said, well, but there's 2 cloths, and one's in Italy and one's in Spain. How can they be authentic? I said, 2 cloths over 2,000 years. It is possible they might have gotten separated. But somebody was trying to use that as an excuse to deny both. And I have seen it, and I believe that there is a relationship. I don't know that that's been proven scientifically, but I do believe that we can at least look at that as a viable possibility for the second cloth.
Well, we thank you for joining us for this very interesting discussion on the Shroud of Turin. It's been a pleasure to have you, Barrie, and to get some of your insight on the investigation in the Shroud and the current studies that are going on in your own website. So we appreciate you coming here and telling us all about this. And to remember, dear family, that this network is brought to you by you, and we're able to bring wonderful guests like Barrie Schwortz here because of your contribution and your assistance in our work. So please do continue to remember us. And we would love to have you come and visit us here at the Shrine of the Most Blessed Sacrament, where we have the Shroud exhibit, and also the Lourdes Grotto that you can see, the beautiful church there. Attend one of the EWTN programs here. Barrie, did you have any final words that you'd like to?
Well, I'd like to remind everybody, if you want to really get into real depth study of the Shroud, remind people to please come to shroud.com. Understand that I may have founded the website, but I gave up the ownership of that and all of the photography and all of the materials, and several of the guys who passed away, their families left me their materials. All of that has been transferred legally over to our nonprofit organization, Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, or STERA Inc. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit, so I don't want people to think that I'm doing this and getting paid big bucks to be on EWTN, Father. So I would ask people, if they're interested, check out the website, and we are a nonprofit, so we can use all the help we can get.
Great. And you're busy traveling all over to present the truths about the shroud that you discovered.
Correct.
Wonderful.
That's my mission.
Very good. So once again, we thank you for being with us tonight. And let us remember today, when I was praying with the EWTN employees, we read St. Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 2. And there is a very ancient hymn where it says, though he was in the form of God, he did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather he emptied himself, born in the likeness of men. And he gave himself to death, even to death on a cross. And so that tells us the great love that Jesus has for you and for me. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.